The diamond necklace is gone. It was last seen Friday evening. Only the staff was in this wing over the weekend.
Renee Williams had spent 34 years learning how to survive in rooms that weren't built for her. She grew up in Compton, California, in a two-bedroom house that her grandmother had rented for 27 years. A house where the hot water ran when it felt like it, and the windows rattled every time a truck passed on the street outside. Her grandmother, Miss Erline, was a woman who had cleaned other people's homes for 4 decades, and she raised Renee on 2 things: scripture and work ethic. "Your hands are your currency, baby," she used to say, pressing Renee's palms flat between hers. "Work hard, keep your head down, and God will honor it." Renee believed her. She still does. She started cleaning houses at 18, straight out of high school, with no college fund and no connections, and nothing but Miss Erline's words and a willingness to outwork every other applicant in the room. She built a reputation over 12 years that her agency described as spotless. Senators, tech executives, retired NFL players, Silicon Valley money. She knew how to walk into a 14-room house, move through it like water, and leave without a single person feeling like their space had been disturbed. Invisibility was her craft. It was what separated her from everyone else. But invisibility has a cost that nobody talks about, and Renee was about to find out exactly what she had been paying for all those years. Take a time out to click the subscribe button as you enjoy this story. Also turn on your notification button for more stories that inspire you. The Whitmore estate sat on 42 acres, just outside of Scottsdale, Arizona, all glass and white stone, surrounded by desert landscape that had been sculpted into something almost aggressively beautiful. The first morning Renee drove up that private road, she pulled out her phone and called her cousin Tasha and said, "Girl, I don't think I'm in California anymore." Tasha laughed on the other end of the line. Renee didn't know then that laughter would feel far away for a long time after that. The man who owned the estate was Garrett Whitmore, 61 years old, silver-haired, broad-shouldered, the kind of man who filled a room without raising his voice. He had started with a single strip mall in Phoenix in his early 30s and had turned it, through 30 years of calculated ambition, into a commercial real estate portfolio worth $2.8 billion. Forbes had written about him twice. He sat on the boards of 3 charitable foundations. He gave keynote speeches at gala dinners and shook hands with governors and was described in every profile ever written about him as self-made, principled, and generous. Renee would come to understand that the story a house tells from the outside is the most practiced lie it knows how to tell. Garrett's wife was Claudia, 47 years old, stunning in the way that severe precision can be stunning, all sharp cheekbones and careful posture, and a wardrobe managed by a personal stylist who came to the estate every Monday morning. Claudia was polite to Renee in the particular way that certain wealthy women are polite to their housekeepers. Warm enough on the surface that it could never be called cold, but with a quality of looking through her rather than at her, as though Renee were a window and whatever was on the other side of her was more interesting than she was. She said, "Please." She said, "Thank you." Her eyes never changed when she said either one. There were 2 children who existed around the edges of the estate. Preston was Garrett's son from his first marriage, 28 years old, restless, handsome in a way he clearly knew and relied on, splitting his days between the private gym on the property and whatever was happening on his phone. And there was Brittany, Claudia's daughter from her own first marriage, 24, always dressed like she was walking into a room she expected to own, spending half her time at the estate and half at an apartment in Scottsdale that Garrett paid for without apparent complaint. Renee was the 3rd housekeeper the Whitmores had hired in 2 years. She found that out from Maria, the cook, a compact, efficient woman of 52, who had worked in that kitchen for 6 years and communicated mostly through expressions rather than words. On Renee's second day, Maria poured her a cup of coffee during a break and looked at her steadily and said, Do your job. Don't ask questions, and whatever you hear in this house, forget it by the time you get to your car. Renee nodded and told herself Maria was being dramatic. It was only later that she understood Maria had been offering her a survival guide, and she had been too new to know it. For 8 months, Renee worked and said nothing and noticed everything. That was the nature of the job. You mapped a house the way a sailor mapped water, not because you wanted to, but because understanding the currents was how you avoided the rocks. She knew that Garrett left for the office by 7:15 every weekday and returned between 6 and 7. She knew that Claudia had lunch with friends on Wednesdays and spent Thursday afternoons in the estate's private gym. She knew that Preston was usually gone by 10 in the morning, to where she wasn't sure, and that Brittany came and went on a schedule that seemed to answer to nothing and no one. Garrett told her once, passing through a hallway she had just finished, stopping, looking around, and saying with genuine appreciation, "Renee, this place hasn't looked this good in years." She thanked him. From the far end of the hall, Claudia had been standing and watching. She heard every word. She turned and walked away without saying anything. Renee filed that moment in the back of her mind and told herself it meant nothing. She was good at telling herself things meant nothing. But around the 9th month, the things she was telling herself about started to multiply. A car she didn't recognize began appearing at the East Gate on Tuesday evenings, a dark-colored sedan, always after 6, always gone before Garrett arrived home on Wednesday mornings. A fragrance that didn't belong to Claudia began lingering in the East Wing hallway. Something warmer, something with sandalwood and amber. A woman's perfume that wasn't Claudia's sharp, expensive signature. A second coffee cup that would appear in the sitting room, washed and returned to the cabinet, but not quite dried, still faintly warm on Tuesday evenings when Renee finished up and walked through for her final check. She wiped the counters. She straightened the pillows. She drove home, and she did not think about it. And then Brittany's behavior started to shift. Renee had Brittany's routine mapped out the way she mapped everything in the house. Not out of curiosity, but out of professional necessity, to avoid being in the wrong room at the wrong time. But Brittany began spending more time in the main house, and specifically in the East Wing, outside the corridor that led to Garrett's private office. Renee would find her there with her phone, leaning against the wall with a studied casualness that didn't quite land, always claiming she was waiting for her mother. But Claudia was never nearby when it happened, never within 3 rooms. It was a small thing, the kind of thing a person could explain away with a single reasonable sentence. But Renee had spent 12 years in other people's houses. She knew the difference between a person who happened to be somewhere and a person who was positioning themselves to see something. She noticed, and then, because noticing things had never once made her life easier, she told herself she hadn't. Until the Thursday she found the notebook. She was cleaning the primary bedroom suite, Garrett and Claudia's room, working through the walk-in closet, which was larger than the living room Renee had grown up in. She was reorganizing the shelves on Claudia's side when she saw it. A small leather notebook, dark brown, sitting on the top shelf behind a stack of velvet jewelry boxes, wedged halfway behind a hat box as though it had been pushed there quickly, carelessly, by someone who needed it out of sight. Renee's rule was absolute. She did not touch personal items. She moved around them, cleaned under them, returned them to their exact positions, and registered nothing about their contents. 12 years, not once broken. But when she shifted the hat box to dust behind it, the notebook tumbled forward and fell open on the shelf. She wasn't looking for anything. Her eyes simply landed on the page before she could redirect them, and what she read in 3 lines of Claudia's neat, slanted handwriting stopped her cold. Account transfer. Confirm with D before Tuesday. Garrett cannot know about the Sedona property. If Preston keeps asking questions, tell Brittany to handle it. Renee stood in that closet for 3 full seconds without moving. Then she closed the notebook carefully, placed it back behind the jewelry boxes at exactly the angle it had been, and finished the room. She drove home. She sat at her kitchen table until 11 o'clock at night, staring at nothing, and she made herself the same promise she had been making for months. It was not her business. It was not her house. It was not her family. It was not her fight. She believed that promise for exactly 2 more weeks. The diamond necklace went missing on a weekend in early October. It was a piece Garrett had commissioned for Claudia on their 5th wedding anniversary. A South Sea pearl and diamond collar necklace, custom designed by a jeweler in New York, valued at $65,000. It lived in a specific box in the jewelry room, a small climate-controlled space adjacent to the primary closet, behind a glass case that Renee dusted every Thursday without fail. In 9 months, she had never opened that case. She had never touched a single item inside it. On a Monday morning, Claudia assembled the household staff in the main foyer, Renee, Maria, and Roland, the groundskeeper, and announced that the necklace was gone. Her voice was composed. Her posture was perfect. She said she had last seen it on Friday evening and that only the staff had been in that wing of the house over the weekend. She looked at Maria, she looked at Roland, and then she looked at Renee, and she held that gaze just a half-second longer than the others. Not long enough to point to. Long enough to land. The agency called Renee on Tuesday afternoon. By Tuesday evening, she had a voicemail informing her that her placement was under review pending investigation. She sat in her car in the parking lot of a Kroger, and she cried. Not the kind of crying that comes from surprise. The kind that comes from recognition, from seeing a shape you've seen before in different rooms, different sizes, different zip codes, but always the same outline. You work twice as hard. You follow every rule. You make yourself small and quiet and unproblematic. And then one day someone needs a story and you become it. Not because of anything you did. Because of what you look like, where you came from, and the fact that nobody with power is going to pause and say, "Wait! Let's be certain!" She called her cousin Tasha. She called her grandmother. And then she sat very still in the dark of her car, and she thought about those 3 lines in a leather notebook on a shelf in a closet. She never should have been the only person in. She drove back to the estate the next morning. Not because she was scheduled to. Not because anyone had called her back. She drove back because her name was being attached to a lie, and she was not willing to let that lie walk unopposed. Garrett Whitmore was in his office. His assistant Dana, who had always greeted Renee with genuine warmth, went in to announce her, and Renee heard Garrett say without hesitation, "Send her in." She walked in, and she stood straight and she looked him directly in the eye. She said, "Mr. Whitmore, I need 5 minutes. I need you to hear me out. And when I'm done, you can do whatever you want with what I tell you." He studied her for a moment the way a man studies someone when he's trying to decide what kind of person he's dealing with. Then he said, "Sit down, Renee." She sat, and she told him everything. She told him she had not touched the necklace. She told him she had not taken anything from his home in 9 months, and that her record with the agency would confirm every word of that. She told him she had not come to plead. She had come because there were things happening inside his home that he deserved to know about, and she could not in good conscience let a lie about her stand, while she stayed silent about a larger truth. He said nothing. He waited, so she told him about the notebook. She told him the exact words she had read, the account transfer, the name D, the Sedona property. She told him about the Tuesday evening car at the East Gate, the wrong fragrance in the East Wing, the washed but still warm coffee cup. She told him about Brittany's pattern outside his office, the positioning, the timing, the way it mapped against Claudia's movements on those same evenings. She told him about the conversations she had caught fragments of between Claudia and Preston, the flatness in Claudia's voice when Preston raised questions about the estate's finances, the rehearsed quality of her answers, the way she shut those conversations down before they could develop. She told him all of it, every detail she had noticed and stored away in the professional, involuntary archive of a woman who had spent 12 years learning to see without looking. When she was finished, the office was completely silent. Garrett Whitmore did not raise his voice. He did not stand up. He did not perform any of the reactions a person might expect from a man whose life was being quietly disassembled in front of him in a leather chair in his own office. He sat completely still, and he looked at the surface of his desk, and he breathed, slow and even, like a man who had practiced staying level in difficult moments and was drawing on every bit of that practice right now. Then he looked back up at Renee and he said, "How long have you known this?" She said, "Long enough to know I should have told you sooner. I'm sorry for that." He was quiet for another long moment. Then he picked up his phone, dialed, and said 4 words. "Get me Warren. Now." Warren Aldrich had been Garrett Whitmore's attorney for 22 years. He arrived at the estate within 2 hours, drove up that private road in a black car, and disappeared into Garrett's office for the rest of the afternoon. Renee was asked to stay. She sat in the staff kitchen with Maria, who kept refilling her coffee, without being asked, and without saying much of anything. Once, Maria looked at her across the table, with an expression that communicated a long, complicated history in a single glance. An expression that said she had been waiting for something like this for years, that she had known the shape of it even when she couldn't see its edges clearly. Renee looked back at her and thought about all the mornings she had been told to forget things before she got to her car. She wondered how much Maria had been forgetting. She wondered what it cost her. Over the following 72 hours, things moved with the quiet, precise speed of money and legal authority. Warren made calls, discreet calls, careful calls, the kind that do not appear in any visible record, but which unlock information faster than any public process ever could. Within 48 hours, he had confirmed the existence of a property in Sedona, Arizona, a 3-bedroom home on 2 acres, purchased 14 months earlier for $1.2 million. It was registered in the name of an LLC that traced back, through a single layer of corporate documentation, to a variation of Claudia's maiden name. She had formed the company 18 months ago through a filing in Nevada. The money used to purchase the property had come from a joint investment account that Garrett had not accessed or reviewed in over a year. D was a man named Derek Hale, 43 years old, real estate developer. He and Claudia had met at a charity auction in Scottsdale 3 years earlier. The dark-colored sedan at the East Gate on Tuesday evenings was registered to a leasing company under his name. The necklace was located in Brittany's apartment in Scottsdale. It had not been sold. It had not been pawned or transferred. It had been moved there at Claudia's direction, quietly, deliberately, in preparation for an insurance claim that would have been filed for a theft that was entirely staged. Renee, who had been in the jewelry room more recently than anyone else on staff, who had no powerful connections and no legal resources, who could be described as a woman with motive if a story needed to be built. Renee had been selected for that story before the necklace ever left the case. On the 3rd day, Garrett called her back into his office. He looked like a man who had traveled a great distance in a very short time. Not physically, but in the way that certain kinds of knowledge ages a person, the kind that redraws the map of everything you thought you understood about your own life. The papers on his desk were stacked neatly, the way a man stacks things when he needs the physical world to be orderly, because the interior world no longer is. He looked at Renee and he said, "I owe you an apology that I don't have adequate words for." She said, "I just needed you to know the truth, Mr. Whitmore." He nodded slowly, and then he looked at her with an expression she recognized. Not pity, not guilt alone, but something quieter and more considered. Respect, The kind that costs something to give because it requires admitting that someone you underestimated turned out to be more than you had prepared for. He told her that Claudia had been asked to leave the property. He told her that the matter of the Sedona LLC and the account transfers was now in Warren's hands and would be handled through proper legal channels. He told her that the accusation against her would be cleared with the agency in full, and that a formal statement from Warren's firm would accompany a letter ensuring that her professional record reflected the truth. And then he slid an envelope across the desk. "This doesn't make it right," he said, "but I want you to know that your integrity was not invisible in this house, even if it looked that way." Renee sat in her car in the driveway of the Whitmore estate for a long time after she left his office. She opened the envelope with hands that weren't quite steady. Inside was a check that made her breath catch and hold, and beneath the check was a handwritten note on Garrett Whitmore's personal stationery, in his own handwriting, that said, "A person who tells the truth in a room full of liars is rare. Thank you for being that person in mine." She looked up through the windshield at the estate. All that white stone and glass rising up against the Arizona sky, the desert light falling across it, at an angle that made it look almost like a painting. She thought about her grandmother in Compton, pressing her hands flat and telling her that God would honor the work. She thought about 12 years of making herself invisible, in rooms that didn't belong to her, learning to see and to say nothing, learning to notice and to move on. She thought about how close she had come to staying quiet, how close she had come to swallowing it. The accusation, the injustice, the whole false story that had been constructed for her, and simply disappearing, the way the help was supposed to disappear. She thought about the 3 lines in a leather notebook that fell open at exactly the right moment, and she drove away from the Whitmore estate for the last time, not because the money in that envelope gave her permission to stop, but because something had shifted in her that couldn't be undone. When a person spends a long time making themselves smaller than they are, and then finally takes up exactly the space they deserve, not more, not less, exactly the right amount, something changes in the architecture of who they are. You can't go back to the shape you were before. The walls don't fit anymore. What happened on those 42 acres outside of Scottsdale was not really about a necklace. It was not even, in the end, about Claudia Whitmore or Derek Hale or the Sedona property or the legal proceedings that would quietly unfold over the following months in rooms that Renee was never in and never needed to be. It was about a woman who had spent 34 years being told, in ways spoken and unspoken, loud and invisible, that her job was to work and be quiet and disappear. And it was about the moment she decided that the truth mattered more than the comfort of staying small. Miss Erline had told her God would honor it. She just hadn't told her it would look like this. But then, that was the thing about the truth. It never arrived on the schedule you planned for. It arrived when it was ready. And when it did, nothing in the world, not money, not power, not the practiced smile of a woman who had never once looked at Renee Williams like she was a real person, could stop it. If this story moved you, share it with somebody who needs to hear it today. And drop a comment. Would you have told the truth in Renee's position, or would you have walked away? I want to know. Subscribe and hit that bell because I tell stories like this every single week. I'll see you in the next one.